In the name of God, most beneficious, most merciful. My PhD thesis was about the Arab region, studying the impact of the regional forces on the Arab world, whether it is Iran, Turkey, or Israel, and the influence of other Arab powers, including Egypt and Saudi. I have been studying this topic closely and studying the impact of these countries in the Arabian Peninsula and in the other parts of the Arab world. They have always been part of my interest. If we wish to study the influence of regional powers on Yemen, there are many factors. First, why Yemen is so uncovered and exposed to them, to international and regional powers, why it is open to these parties or these countries that do not have this much of power, countries such as UAE, which is considered a small country on the balance of power. In Yemen, our problem has been that we failed to be a real state. There has always been a void through which other countries may have influence, whether it was in the south or in the north. In the south, the National Progressive Front may have built a country, or the government there may have built that, and that system exploded in the 1986, and then we had the war and we went back to the first square. And in the north, people perceived the state as another tribe, a tribe that represents the president, working for the interests of the members of that tribe. This is why we failed. We always worked, and we have always seen that Saudi influence in Yemen has always been there, and even during the time of Ali Abdullah Saleh, there has been influence. And during the Jeddah Agreement, according to the Saudi perception that was ratified and signed off by the former president in order to receive the Saudi support to be in power and for his son to be in power, the Saudis requested a strange condition, which is the cancellation of military conscription. They requested that military service is no longer mandatory in Yemen. There used to be 90,000 to 100,000 young Yemenis who used to serve in the army, and Yemen has had in the past about 2 million Yemenis on the reserve. The Saudis have always feared Yemen. They've always thought of themselves as the leading country in the Arab Peninsula, and they wish for the other countries to follow them. Yemen was an exception. Yemen was a big country with its size of population, history, and the political movement, because in Yemen we had political parties. They have always been there. They had their voices really heard, and the world was listening. In Saudi, for them, they see that Yemen is the social twin of Saudi Arabia. And the Yemeni state is the only state with a demographic connection with the Saudi state, as there is a population extension from the north of Yemen to the south of Saudi in Asir and Najran and other areas. For example, with other countries, there is a big desert void that separates the population. Saudi has always seen Yemen as a source of risk, and it was waiting. It was thinking that Yemenis were waiting for the right time to influence the Saudis. This is why they have always wanted to have influence in Yemen and to stop Yemen from being a powerful state. This is why they have bought regional loyalties, and they have damaged the efforts of the political leaders, including the efforts of the martyr President Ibrahim al-Hamdi. That regional influence is old. It already exists. In addition to that, regional powers increased. Iran did not have influence. It sought to make gains in Yemen through the export of the Islamic Revolution by the end of the 80s and by the early 90s. And Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, was blackmailing the Saudis and trying to make up for the absence of Iraq. Yemen was subject to that influence. There was always conflicting parties in Yemen requesting and seeking foreign support. That issue was repeated over and over again. As you know, Yemen, in its history and its structure, has always been subject to regional influence. As we have seen, some see Yemen as a source of risk, like the Saudis. Now they see Yemen as a country that can be contained and controlled. And I think that the Iranian example in Iraq inspired Saudis to do that, so that they control Yemen as a country with a lot of heritage and history. There was a void in power, a void that lacks a strong state and government, and they tried to fill in that gap and to seek their own interests. Western countries saw Yemen in a different way. When we go back to regional powers, there are three main powers: Iran, through its relations with the Houthis, Emirates, and Saudi. There are other countries that may influence him but do not have the desire, like Egypt. Other countries would like to, but they don't have the means and resources and geographical closeness to do that, like Turkey. Internationally, there are two countries: Britain, as the Yemeni file, and the GCC file is a British file. And in addition to that, there is the USA. If we discuss the British rule, we see that Britain re-engineers communities where it wishes to exercise influence. This is why we see that they accept the Houthi role. They do not want to overcome that. And Britain is trying recently to recognize them. The U.S. have always perceived Yemen as a security file, not as a political file. Therefore, most of the senior staff responsible for the Yemeni file in the U.S. government are intelligence officers. And this was very important for their strategy, for their philosophy in the area, which is the protection of the minorities, as they are trying to utilize them in combating Sunni military movements. They know that they cannot depend on government systems, and the regime of Abdullah Saleh utilized the war against extremist violence groups in order to make gains from the Americans and in order to have his son presiding over that force. So the Americans used to solve this through alliances with traditional enemies of those terrorist forces. So there are countries that used to treat Yemen as a risk and now containing it, the UAE started to fill that void and to utilize it in order to have control. Britain wishes to regain its former influence in the area because the Arab area is still the only region where Britain can exercise its great power role. They cannot do that in other parts of the world. They can do that in the Arab world. For the Americans, they see it as Afghanistan with seashores, and they want to have some sort of alliance, whether it's explicit or implicit, in order to have control in combating Islamic movements.